to just say, this is my third weekend in a row following Bob Goff. I absolutely adore you, Bob. So thrilled to be here with you in Indianapolis. I'm wondering, did you hear about the ATM repairman, who was changing out a lock? Yes, right? Of an ATM of a Bank of America in the middle of a scorching July afternoon in Corpus Christi, Texas. And the repairman found himself trapped inside the ATM machine. And he'd left his phone, not in his back pocket, but in the truck. So the repairman did what you would do. He scribbled out SOS notes and slipped them out of the ATM machine where customers are standing there waiting to get not an SOS note, but money. And instead they get the surprise note, help, I'm stuck in here. Come on. What would you do if you're standing in front of the ATM machine and get this note that literally reads, please help. I'm the repair guy stuck in this broken down ATM machine and I don't have my phone. Please call my boss at this number. Everyone thought it was a prank, a joke. The repairman yelled for help. He slipped out SOS notes after SOS notes. And customer after customer thought he was pranking them. No one called the police. No one called his boss. And for 3 hours in the scorching heat of July, Texas afternoon, he was trapped in that ATM machine. Until one guy hailed down a police officer and said, you're going to think I'm crazy, but I think there's somebody inside the ATM machine. The police officer, whose name was Corpus Christi Police Senior Officer Richard Oden, said, sure enough, we could hear a little voice coming from inside the machine. And it took the police more than 30 minutes to free the poor repairman from his captivity. You want to know something? So I read this story, I'm thinking, this is wild and crazy. But the ATM repairman is not the only one sending out his SOS notes into a world that isn't paying attention, who has made comfort their way and self their truth and wealth their life. There is a whole world of people out there trapped in all kinds of broken down situations, and they're sending out their SOS notes, and they're hollering, and they're begging, and they're waiting, and we read their notes, and we ignore them. We shrug our shoulders and focus on getting what we need. There's a whole world out there who's in their own kind of captivity, and they are hoping someone will generously open their hands, reach out to them, and live cruciform, cross-form, cross-shaped, and break the machines of injustice and break them free. I think of Queen Esther, that young Jewish girl who found herself as a Persian queen when her people faced genocide, who are sending out their own SOS notes. And Esther was where she was for such a time as this. This is what it means to lead well. I've stood in a kitchen of sorts in a dump in Guatemala City and looked into the whites of kids' eyes, eating whatever they could find in rotting piles of refuse, the vultures circling overhead. I've knelt beside a little girl in Uganda who held her bowl in her 2 hands, held it up for me to see what she'd caught for dinner, these dozens of crawling bugs. Sat in a cold shipping container in Iraq with refugee women whose brothers and fathers were shot in front of them by ISIS, women who had to make a split-minute decision about which of their children, they only had 2 arms, which ones they were going to grab and run. Women who had nothing but rationed their tea so that we could sit down, hear their stories, and shared tears as multiply healing. And it's all of their faces I see, and all of your faces I see. When I read Esther's cousin, Mordecai, his words, he says, don't think for a moment that because you're in the palace, you will escape when all your people suffer. If you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief will come from somewhere else. But you and yours
will die. This is leading well. You have got to risk your position inside the palace for those outside, or you risk losing everything, even your own soul. You have got to give your gifts, or they become your idols, and you become the walking dead. If you don't risk your position, your palace, your platform, your power for those on the outside, you will find yourself inside a prison of your own making. If your living isn't about giving, then you're already dying. You've got to use the life you've been given to give others life. If your life isn't about giving relief, you don't get real life. This is leading well. Give relief or you find none. For what's the profit of man to gain the whole world but to lose his own soul? This is leading well in a broken-hearted world. Break the machines of injustice and pay attention to all the people with their SOS notes, all the people outside the gate, for you're called for such a time as now. You know what? We could be the ones outside the gate. We all could have been the ones fighting the Lord's resistance army, slitting your child's throat in the middle of the night. We could be the one born in a slum, violently raped and left for dead. We could be the ones born into starvation, into lives of Christless desperation. There are so many of us drinking down our lattes and dying of thirst, dying for something more, for something abundant. There are so many in need and so many Esthers who thirst for more than vanilla lives and sweetened programs and watered down vision, hungry to take the broken way and have some real meat for their starved souls, some dirt under their fingernails, some real sacrifice in their veins. There are those who are saved, but only by the skin of their teeth, because they cared most about their own skin and minimally about others. They will have hardly an abundant entrance awaiting them in heaven. But that is not us who are the Esthers. There are those who would rather turn a blind eye to the needy than turn to the needy and be like Christ. Those who would love playing at being Christian more than actually being one and love giving. But that's not us who are the Esthers. There's a whole generation of Esthers who want to be the gift, who want to give it forward today, whatever's in our hands, who want holy more than hollow, who want the abundant life of being dead to all ladders and going to the least and the lonely and lost. The world needs people, real leaders, who will defy cynical indifference by making a critical difference. Every one of us can start changing headlines when we start reaching out our hands. When we shape and form our lives like a cross, broken and given like bread, cruciform. We can be concerned for the poor, but be no less concerned for us who claim not to be rich so we can excuse ourselves from giving. Go ahead and show concern for the poor, but be no less concerned if we've just done enough to assuage our consciences, just enough to pat ourselves on the back, but not enough that we've ever felt true sacrifice, that we've ever actually lived broken and given. Go ahead. Live concerned for the poor, but be no less concerned for avoiding suffering, because someday we will face Christ. What if we care? What if caring for the poor was more than just caring about easing our consciences? What if caring for the poor meant sacrifice, and that was abundant living? What I'm asking you is, are we giving to God what we can afford to give? Or are we giving to God what changes how we live? Break the machines to break the captives free. Break down the gates in our generation for such a time as now. This summer I suffered heart failure. And I'm telling you, suffering can be a friend who drives you where you didn't need it to go at all. And life's detours means God wants you to run into his arms so he can reconstruct your life. And I was hacking away in the hospital, and they're hooking me up to a heart monitor. and I'm completely confused as I think I just got pneumonia. The doctor writes it right on the chart. Tipped into heart failure. And it's right there in ink, and I sort of want to laugh. I didn't just tip into heart failure right now. I've struggled with heart failure for years. Failing family, failing sons and daughters, failing in relationships and busted expectations. I mean, my very first memory is being 4 years old and watching my baby sister walk across our farmyard in November light. And I'd stood with my mama in the kitchen. We could see it, how a truck, farm supply truck, drove up our lane, turned around in the yard, and drove right over my baby sister. And right from the very beginning, the weight of the world sort of crushed my heart. That little 4-year-old girl who'd witnessed her sister's skull being crushed under that truck, fears were the soul mold for that little girl. And by the time I was 7, I had an ulcer eating out my gut, and by my teen years, I was cutting, and by the time I was 20, I was wild with anxiety. The doctor put me on medication for agoraphobia, which is anxiety about being in places or situations from which escape might be difficult. Sort of like right now, being on a stage. God has a crazy sense of humor. But how in the world do you lead and lead well in a broken world? When you feel like you're carrying your own unspoken broken? How do you break the machines and meet the SOSs in the world when you've got your own quiet SOS in your soul? How can you be an S'er and risk it all for those outside the gate when you feel like an outsider with your own unspoken broken? You know what? Everybody is broken, at least the honest of us are. Every single person you meet is not only fighting a hard battle, but that battle has broken them a little bit. Real leaders are the ones who have known the brokenness of failure, the brokenness of suffering, the brokenness of loss, and have found the wholeness of Christ through that brokenness. They simultaneously lead by allowing their scars to point the rest of us towards a wholeness that comes only through brokenness. I was 18 with scars across my wrist when I heard a pastor tell a whole congregation that he had once lived next to the loony bin. And I'd looked at the floor when everyone else had laughed. They didn't know how I had left my only mama behind the locked doors of a psychiatric ward more than a few times. When they laughed, I felt the blood sort of drain away from my face, and I wanted to stand up and howl. It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I wanted to stand up and beg. When the church isn't for the suffering and broken, then the church isn't for Christ. Because Jesus, with his pure side, is always on the side of the broken. Jesus always moves into places moved with grief. Jesus always seeks out where the suffering is, and that's where Jesus stays. The wound in his side proves that Jesus is always on the side of suffering, the wounded, the busted, and the broken. Leading well through brokenness means you don't run from brokenness, you're drawn to brokenness, like Jesus is. Leading well means you aren't driven to climb ladders to achieve status or amass wealth. You take the broken way and break those idols. Anything you put before God is an idol. Anything you love with all your heart is an idol. Anything you can't stop thinking about is an idol. Leading well means you break those idols and you are driven to go where things aren't well. Look at Jesus, who offers a radically different understanding of what it means to be a leader. In a world of ladders, external credentials qualify a person to lead. In Jesus' cross-form world, interior character qualifies a person to lead. In a world of ladders, what matters most are the kind of outcomes we produce. In Jesus' cross-formed world, what matters is the kind of people we are becoming. In a world of ladders, success is measured by material accumulation, power, and positions that we hold. In Jesus' cross-formed world, success is measured by material generosity, humility, and the people whom we get to serve. Look at leaders who lead well through brokenness. Broken-hearted Joseph, who was disowned by his brothers and thrown into an Egyptian prison, later became the prime minister of Egypt. Busted Noah, a man who got drunk and passed out naked, was part of God's rescue plan for planet Earth. Bruised and limping Abraham, at times a cowardly husband and a dysfunctional father, became the spiritual forerunner of all who have faith. Betraying Peter, a hot-headed fisherman, an erratic disciple who denied Jesus 3 times, later became a bold truth-teller who courageously gave up everything for Jesus, was crucified upside down. Hannah tasted salty tears of infertility. Elijah begged the Lord to take his life. David asked his soul 1,000 times why it was so downcast. And then there was Jesus, who was despised and rejected by men. God chooses the weak. God does great things through the greatly wounded. To be a great leader, bring your brokenness to the table. The Lord needs